I believe there are a few events in my life which have not happened to many.
Equiano was a black slave who emerged from the horrors of the African Holocaust to become an English gentleman, marrying a white woman, and the author of one of the most influential books of his generation, his autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Aluuda Equiano, the African. Equiano published his book in 1789, when revolution was in the air. As the French stormed the Bastille, Britain was in the grip of its own revolution, a period of social, political, economic, and religious upheaval.
It was a time of great sort of roiling turmoil, a prudery on the one hand and great licentiousness on the other. Coffee begins, and people sit in coffee shops and treat them as their offices, and crimes take place, and yet people are having very high-flown ideas about poetry and neoclassicism. And oddly enough, a black man born elsewhere fitted into this idea of a changing England. In a way, Equiano could be the first black Englishman in a real way of being English that no one else had been before.
As a quintessential English gentleman who had been enslaved as a child, Equiano held a mirror up to his readers and challenged their wealth and culture, their supposed morals and Christian faith. He challenged the whole fabric of a society built on the back of slavery.
The British were absolutely central to the whole Atlantic slave trade. The British don't start it, the British don't pioneer it. That's the Spanish, that's the Portuguese, it's then the Dutch. But the British come to perfect it. They're the ones who hone it to a quite extraordinary degree of economic profitability. And it's the British who ultimately carry more Africans than any other maritime nation. The problem for the British is that it looks as if it's, viewed from Britain, it looks as if it's something a long way away. It looks as if it's African or it's American or it's Atlantic, but it isn't. There are thousands of British ships involved. There are tens of thousands of British sailors. There are dozens and dozens of British ports on economic hinterlands of those ports in Britain, all of them benefiting from the slave trade. The British are the critical agents in this.
Equiano's life story forced the British public to face up to their role in the suffering of millions of Africans. The book was an instant bestseller and made its author a wealthy man. It also turned him into one of the most well-known men of his time as he embarked on a promotional tour of the country.
I pray you, attend.
As they symbolize, in a word, it lays open an endless field of commerce to the British manufacturers.
He was a real go-getter. Here is someone who would fit into the 21st century immediately. He'd be running some big operation right now. There's no doubt about it.
However, I had but a very small capital to begin with. For one single half-bit, which is equal to 3 pence in England.
He's obviously was what we would call an extrovert, or we would call a wheeler dealer.
In process of time, I became a master of a few pounds, and in a fair way of making...
One thing that intrigues me is his skills as a businessman and self-promotion through the production and distribution of the book. You know, the way he sold the book and the way he held on to the copyright, gambling on himself, sort of investing in himself, was something most of us wouldn't do now.
You know, we don't have the traveling author in those days, in the same way that we do now. We're so used to people going on book tour, and he may have begun one of the earliest book tours ever. And people were able to see him. Here was the man who wrote the book.
My feet scarcely touched the ground, for they were winged with joy, and like Elijah, as he rose to heaven.
Articulate, educated, signed his books, I don't have any doubt. Then suddenly we're not talking about someone on a plantation out there somewhere. We're talking about a man in your parlor who's speaking very articulately about his experiences and the experiences of others, and they believe him.
In order to achieve maximum effect for his anti-slavery cause, Equiano transformed himself into the personification of his time, a highly literate, entrepreneurial, wealthy gentleman of religion and conscience. The story of how he made this remarkable journey from slave to gentleman is a landmark in the struggle for abolition and a fascinating insight into a time before the class system took hold, a time of social mobility and opportunity for black and white alike. Equiano's story begins in Africa. He was born in 1745 in a corner of what is now southeastern Nigeria. He describes a loving childhood in a cultured and spiritual society, a childhood that was shattered when, at the age of 11, he was captured by African slavers.
One day, when only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both. The only comfort we had was being in one another's arms all that night and bathing in each other's tears. The next day proved a day of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced. For my sister and I were then separated, while we lay clasped in each other's arms.
The slave trade depended on groups of African slavers capturing men, women and children from inland tribes and transporting them to the coast. Here, the European traders would buy them to sell on to plantation owners in the Americas. This voyage was known as the Middle Passage. Some historians estimate more than 12 million Africans were transported in this way during the years of the slave trade.
The most potent piece of writing that Equiano's bequeathed to us is the passage where he describes his experiences in the hold of a slave ship.
The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died.
Even today, to read that section, it's very, very difficult to do to our jaded 21st century sensibilities. Imagine, therefore, the impact that this would have had in 1789.
This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole scene of horror almost inconceivable.
On arrival in the West Indies, Equiano was transported to the American state of Virginia, where he was sold at a local slave market.
On the signal given, as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make a choice of the parcel they like best. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated. Why are parents to lose their children, brothers their sisters, husbands their wives, Surely, this is a new refinement in cruelty.
Stripped of home, family and friends, Equiano was now stripped of his identity. An officer in the Royal Navy, Michael Henry Pascal, purchased him and renamed him Gustavus Vasa.
Gustavus Vasa was the Swedish king who freed his people from the tyranny of the Danes. And it was pretty common in the 18th century to give ironic names to slaves, names of powerful figures like Caesar or Pompey, because it kind of emphasized the arbitrary, absolute control that the slave owner had over his slave.
In 1757, just a year after his capture, with his new master and a new identity, he sailed for England. Away from the chains and suffering of the Middle Passage and the humiliation and horror of the slave market, Equiano's second voyage is described through the 12-year-old's eyes as a voyage of discovery into a new but less terrifying world.
One of the psychological wounds in Equiano's story, in his own life, really is the absence of a family. Not having had a mother, or being taken away from his mother and his sister. There's no doubt that he does grieve very deeply about the loss of family. And so therefore he developed, in the absence of his own family, a father, Captain Pascal, a man of authority.
To be a servant to an English naval officer was a step up from a life of hard labour on a slave plantation. Equiano soon understood that being part of the King's Navy was a position of relative security and full of possibilities for his own advancement.
I now not only felt myself quite easy with these new countrymen, but relished their society and manners. I no longer looked upon them as spirits, but as men, superior to us. I had the strong desire to resemble them, to imbibe their spirit and imitate their manners. I therefore embraced every occasion of improvement, and every new thing that I observed, I treasured up in my memory. I could now speak English tolerably well, and I perfectly understood everything that was said. But I had long wished to be able to read and write, and for this purpose I took every opportunity to gain instruction, but had made yet very little progress. However, when I went to London with my master, I had soon an opportunity of improving myself, which I gladly embraced.
There is a sense that everything is up for grabs in an increasingly urban society. London is somewhere that people always migrated to in order to try and make their way in the world. It's just that in the 18th century, that opportunity is available perhaps to more and more people just because of the sheer size of London. It's the first European metropolis. It's a city of nearly 500,000 people in 1700, and that doubles by 1800 to over 1 million people. People just hadn't seen a city of that size before.
On his arrival in London, Equiano was put into the care of Pascal's cousins, the Mrs. Guerin, who welcomed him into their home and willingly schooled him in literature and arithmetic.
She says that he was absolutely delighted that Pascal's family allowed him to learn to read and write. Equiano's early impressions of England was that education was all. That this was a civilization that divided people into classes according to their educational status. Equiano, as soon as he got into England, sussed out how to survive. You know, I'm not going to run away. I'm going to learn to read and write, and I'm going to move up there with the big boys.
I used to attend these ladies about the town, in which service I was extremely happy, as I had thus many opportunities of seeing London, which I desired of all things.
In that period, there would have been a lot of black people here. Equiano would have found himself among, particularly in London, a thriving community. You would have seen pages carrying the lapdogs of the upper class women, carrying their parcels as they were shopping, perhaps in the theaters. You would have seen them really almost anywhere. You would have found yourself in a very multiracial city.
Equiano was completely entranced by England, and London in particular. He quickly recognized that this was a place of opportunity for him. He was learning to read and write. He was baptized into the Church of England. He had taken his first steps on the road to becoming an English gentleman. But he was still a slave, subject to the whim of his master and the demands of the British Navy. From 1758, England was at war.
Fire as you bear! Stand clear!
Equiano served with distinction for the Royal Navy under Captain Pascal during the 7 Years' War against the French. His master even promoted him to able seaman.
While I was on shipboard, there was one Daniel Queen, about 40 years of age, a man very well educated, who messed with me on board this ship, and he likewise dressed and attended the captain. Fortunately, this man soon became very much attached to me, and took very great pains to instruct me in many things. He taught me to shave, and dress hair a little, and also to read in the Bible.
How beautiful. Beautiful.
Equiano regarded his promotion to able seaman as a promotion out of slavery. He had a career. He was even earning a wage.
It's significant because as an officer servant, the money for the servant is allotted to the officer. It's not paid to the servant. But as soon as someone is promoted to the rating of a seaman, much less an able seaman, which is the next level up, then that money gets paid to the seaman. Now that would help account for why Equiano would assume that he would be given his freedom. Even Equiano's shipmates assumed he would be free. One of them was helping him make plans for what he would do in his freedom.
I thought now of nothing but being free and working for myself, and thereby getting money to enable me to get a good education.
With the end of the war in 1762, Equiano saw freedom within his grasp, only to see it cruelly snatched away when Pascal, whom he had served so loyally, sold him to another master, a Captain Duran.
Do you know me, boy?
No, sir, I do not.
Then I will tell you, I am your new master, and you are my slave.
Sir, forgive me, but my master cannot sell me to you, nor to anyone else.
Why, boy, did your master not buy you?
Yes, sir, it is true, but I have served him loyally for many years, and he has taken all my wages and prize money from our spoils of war. For all I have got is 1/6 pence for my paints. Besides this, sir, I have been baptized, and by the laws of the land, no man has a right to sell me.
The law, you will find, is with me on this, and I urge you.
It is very extraordinary, I think, that so many others have expressed the opposite, and I can only conclude...
You speak too much English, boy, and I advise you to behave yourself in my charge and keep quiet.
Sir!
And if you do not, be sure I have ways aboard this ship of making you quiet.
Pascal had never promised him his freedom. To him, freedom for Equiano was something that he was the one to give. And I think that Equiano's assumption that he was going to be free was probably perceived by Pascal as presumption.
In the first expression of my grief, I reproached my fate and wished I had never been born. I was ready to curse the tide that bore us, the gale that wasted my prison, and even that ship that conducted us. I called on death to relieve me from the horrors I felt and dreaded.
Equiano was taken back to the West Indies to be sold again. At the age of 18, he was back where he started when he first set foot on those islands 7 years earlier. But this next chapter in his life continued his transformation into an English gentleman. Here, at the very heart of the Atlantic slave trade, he learned how to be a businessman.
Captain Duran sent for me on shore one morning, and I was told by the messenger that my fate was then determined. With fluttering steps and trembling heart, I came to the captain.
Now, boy, be calm now.
And found with him one Mr. Robert King, a Quaker, and the first merchant in this place.
I, young man, have been persuaded by these reports of your good character to acquire you. And now that I see you, I've not the least doubt of your good character, and I think we will do well together.
Yes, sir.
Robert King was a slave owner and a Quaker. This meant that he, like many Quakers who believed that all men were born equal, struggled with his conscience.
I will put you to school, because you, my boy, are going to be my clerk.
Quakers were one of the most influential and successful groups in the 18th century. They were businessmen, major iron manufacturers, major confectioners. Their dilemma was that their iron was being used to make chains for the slave traders, and their sweets and biscuits depended on the sugar from their plantations.
Quakers always have this moral dilemma in the 18th century, how to involve themselves in profitable business, but some of that profitable business might actually be involved with slavery. And because slavery is so pervasive, so ubiquitous in the world of the Atlantic, it's very hard to say, I'm not doing that because it's involved with slavery.
Equiano was aware of the growing disquiet in the Quaker community about the ownership and exploitation of their fellow men, but he was still a slave.
The slave trade. How to read the Bible.
King, however, offered him hope. He promised him his freedom if he could repay the £40 sterling that King had paid for him. As Equiano began to travel from the Indies to America on his master's business, he also set about earning hard cash for himself in order to buy his liberty.
How much do you sell them for? How much is this one? How much are they? How much would, for example, this be? How much are your oranges? Good, good, good.
At length I endeavored to try my luck and commence merchant. I had but a very small capital to begin with. For one single half-bit, which was equal to 3 pence in England, made up my whole stock. However, I bought a glass tumbler with my half-bit, and when I came to Montserrat, I sold it for a bit, no, 6 pence. So that my capital now amounted in all to $1, and acquired in a space of a month or 6 weeks.
While working for King, Equiano joined the growing ranks of merchants and entrepreneurs, making their names and their fortunes in a changing world.
The 18th century was a lot about making money. The birth of capitalism, the beginning of speculation, which is something he tapped into with his economic theories, that you could have a little and end up with more.